Okay, now that should work. Hello, welcome to STAT's fourth installment of our 2002 Status List Spotlight series, a conversation with Dr. Otis Brawley, sponsored by YouTube. Thanks for joining us. I'm Matt Herper, senior writer for medicine and editorial director of events here at STAT. And before we get started, a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see several icons. Use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves or to send a message directly to the STAT team. Please don't put your questions for us in the chat. If you do have a question that you would like us to ask during the event, and I hope you do, please use the Q&A feature, type your question out. We'll try to answer it live. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see questions from other attendees, and you can upvote them. I'll pay attention to the upvotes. We'll be taking questions throughout the chat, so don't wait. Go ahead, start to put things in now. This is part of what makes these events fun. We want to hear from you. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome Dr. Garth Graham, Director and Global Head of Healthcare and Public Health and Head of YouTube Health, for a sponsored introduction of today's event.
Thanks, Matt. And I can't tell you how excited I am to be here, hearing from someone who I've just had a tremendous amount of respect in terms of the arc of his career and what he's managed to do. I'm also excited because this is our final Status List Spotlight Series event of 2022. And of course, you're going to hear from Dr. Otis Brawley, who has really just led amazing efforts tackling the depth of cancer and health inequities, and really fighting both of those challenges that our communities have faced on so many different levels. From the Google end, we've been really tackling the issue around information as a determinant of health through our efforts at YouTube. We've been very proactive around this concept of how do we tackle health literacy? How do we tackle and use the power of video to empower communities to make healthier decisions and to deliver information along the patient's journey in an engaging and in a way that patients and communities can understand and really be able to empowered with adequate health information overall. One of the things that we've done is we've launched a series of personal stories, ways in which people can search for information around cancer or mental illness, and see personal stories around individuals who have been impacted by these particular disease entities and understand their patient journeys, in addition to be able to also featuring information from authoritative sources. And it's really this idea about tackling both physical and mental health conditions at scale. And we hope that stories of shared experiences will destigmatize medical conditions, mental illness, and provide access to more emotionally supportive kinds of information. And as we look to next year, we're going to continue to have a wide range of credible, trusted partnerships with a number of organizations across the healthcare ecosystem. And as we continue on that journey, we are even more inspired to work with STAT as well as other organizations to really uplift leaders like Dr. Brawley in their efforts to really tackle issues around health inequities, as I said before, cancers and other afflictions that disproportionately impact our communities. So it's an exciting time to be working on these issues, certainly from our perspective, but working with partners across the board. And I am personally excited to hear from just a true champion when we think about health and public health in Dr. Otis Brawley. Thank you for having me, and back to Matthew for more.
All right. Well, I'd like to welcome to our virtual stage Otis Brawley, Professor of Oncology and Epidemiology at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks to Garth for the introduction. Otis, I've been talking to Otis for a long time, and I remember being told, I was working on a story and someone said, hey, you got to talk to this guy. He'll give you a great quote, which is, the transaction that often really matters to us in journalism. But he's been, one of the people that I think of as kind of the Sherpas that we use in the field, and really an accomplished figure in both cancer and public health, both in the field of of understanding how to screen for prostate cancer, and more importantly, how not to screen for prostate cancer in the PSA wars, but also generally in the evaluation of screening tests and treatments. So we're very happy to have him here. I do recommend, it's a little old. It's not working because it's using my background. Well, he wrote a book that I was trying to show you. Welcome, Otis. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction.
Yeah. So I want to start a little gingerly here. Before we get into the big questions about PSA and multi-cancer detection tests and everything going on. I'd love to kind of know some backstory. So how did you end up deciding you were going to become a doctor? Quickly, because I know it's a long story.
Quickly, I went to the Catholic schools in Detroit, and of course, the first 8 years with the nuns, and the last 4 years high school with the Jesuits. And I was always interested in science. And then I went to the University of Chicago as an undergraduate chemistry major. Actually, a little hostile toward people who wanted to go into medicine. I wanted to go into chemistry and physics.
Be a real scientist.
Yeah, and then finally I started talking to some people. There's a infectious disease doc named Elliot Keefe, who became a very good friend of mine. And he converted me to, or some people might say, perverted me into going into medicine. And that's how I ended up in medicine. When I was in medical school, I developed a number of friends who were oncologists, and I was always interested in policy and medicine and science. And oncology was a good place where there was a lot of policy and science going on. And as the last 35 to 40 years have shown, there's been tremendous science and tremendous advancements in oncology, and the policy issues are now getting wise medicine to the people.
So let's talk about that a bit. What is it that makes medicine science? This feels like a moment for an Otis Brawley mission statement.
Well, medicine is a combination of art as well as science. It is taking things that are known in nature and then applying them to human beings. The art is how you apply them, and that involves explaining them to people and behavior as well.
But I mean, a lot of your career has been talking about how some of the things that doctors think they should practice as art, some of the things they think they should draw freehand.
Yes.
Really getting out the ruler and using what people call evidence-based medicine. What evidence do we have for?
One of the Jesuit priests who influenced me, Richard Polakowski, Father Polakowski, when he heard I was going to medical school, he told me something that I've kept with me ever since because it's so true. He said, remember, there are things you know, things you don't know, and there are things you believe. And doctors have this terrible problem of confusing what they believe with what they know. And so I've spent the last 35 years in medicine always trying to label things. And as Father Polakowski also said, I question what I know more so than anything else, because oftentimes what I know or what we in medicine know turns out to be wrong.
So I want to get to the biggest example of that. But before that, I think I'm going to keep going chronologically, because the hardest time you told me in your medical career was the early part.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, medicine, I suspect other professions are, and certainly we talk about it a lot in sports like basketball. A lot of it has to do with people having confidence in themselves. And I had what was called imposter syndrome. I was worried that I wasn't good enough. When you grow up in the inner city of Detroit, as I did, you are very frequently told that you are not good enough. There are not high expectations. And unfortunately, and this is something I try to talk to young folks about nowadays, unfortunately, you start believing this rhetoric that you're exposed to, and you start not having goals. You start thinking, I cannot achieve. And you have to believe in yourself to a certain extent. And I struggled with that for a good long time, especially in medical school. I came out on top, and it was good for me to have gone through the experience and won. For later things, the prostate cancer wars, where I got attacked an awful lot, for example.
Well, what's the secret to that? I mean, you don't strike me as an arrogant guy.
Yeah.
What gives you that kind of confidence so that when a bunch of people are calling you Dr. Death or whatever sober coming up with, that you can continue to speak about what you believe? How do you?
Well, you know the guts of what you're talking about, or whatever the issue is, you know it better than anybody else. This is the work that's done at night, reading, studying, and you hold basic principles of science. You try to be orthodox to the science, and you have a certain North Star that says you tell the truth and you don't mislead people. You respect people's opinion, but you know what the truth is, and you find out what is truly known, and you identify what is believed versus what is known. And I cannot overemphasize the fact that you have to have that North Star of telling people the truth. And sometimes you do have to have a little, you said that I'm not arrogant. Again, Father Fallon, another Jesuit, used to tell those of us, I went to a Jesuit school that was predominantly white, and he used to tell the black guys, it was an all-male school, you know, sometimes you just need to be, you need to have some pity and feel sorry for people who don't have a challenge. And he said, you know, white people frequently don't have a challenge. You should feel sorry for white people. And he was making a point. It was somewhat, he was joking, but also making a point. In some of these things, and you're right, when in the prostate cancer wars, which we can talk about more, I was called Dr. Death, I was called the Prince of Darkness. There, I actually reveled in the fact that some of the people who were calling me the Prince of Darkness had never read Joseph Conrad and didn't even know that that phrase came from a Joseph Conrad novel, which I, of course, had to read in 10th grade.
So I want to get to the prostate cancer wars now. This was a case where there was a widely used test. Everybody still knows about it, PSA. Pardon.
Mm-hmm.
And people thought that this was a test that every man who was kind of starting to get older should get, and it would detect prostate cancer, and that it would detect cancer early, and that would be better. And we learned that that's not what happened. How did you come to realize that there was a dark side to this idea of testing everybody?
Well,
discovering cancer.
Yeah, well, first, everybody was applying this thing that all of us were taught when we were on our mother's knee, which is the best thing to do about cancer is find it early and cut it out. And having some training in epidemiology, there are several examples where that is not true. In neuroblastoma, for example, screening in children, that is not true. Lung cancer screening with chest x-ray in the 1960s actually may have even killed more people than it helped, because that is not true with lung cancer screening with chest x-ray. Later on, with CT scanning and improvements in technology, lung cancer screening does save lives, but it still actually kills a few people as well. So just knowing basic principles, you start questioning this, find it early and cut it out. And in the case of prostate cancer, you started finding so much prostate cancer. There was a point in time in the middle 1990s where in metropolitan Seattle, the prevalence of men diagnosed with prostate cancer was higher than the prevalence of left-handedness. 15% were left-handed, but 17% of men over the age of 50 in metropolitan Seattle had been diagnosed with prostate cancer. It was very clear that there was some overdiagnosis, and there were some other people, very famous urologists from Memorial Sloan Kettering, who said the quandary in prostate cancer is when cure is possible, is it necessary? When cure is necessary, is it possible? I wasn't the only person who had these concerns. I spoke up, and perhaps because of the color of my skin, I was a lightning rod and attracted a lot of attention. I'll never forget people saying, "You're a black man. How can you question prostate cancer screening?"
Because black men are at higher risk.
Because black men are at higher risk, exactly.
And how could you?
Well, I'm a black man. How can I not tell black men the truth about what's known, what's not known, and what's believed? You see, in prostate cancer screening, we needed a prospective randomized trial, which ultimately showed that prostate cancer screening, while it does prevent some deaths, it's not nearly as good as people thought it was in the 1990s, to the point now about half of all men who are diagnosed with prostate cancer, their initial treatment is observation. Whereas in the 1990s, if you were diagnosed on Tuesday, you were told you need to have your prostate out by certainly the end of the week. So we've progressed. And by the way, I have to congratulate the urology community, because the doctors who treat prostate cancer and the doctors who make money treating prostate cancer, who I criticized in the late 1990s, actually came around to a prostate cancer screening guideline that involves informed decision-making about the potential risks and the potential benefits, the fact that there can be a group of men who are diagnosed with a disease that doesn't need to be treated. Their statement right now is absolutely wonderful. So, we are professionals in medicine, and that's an example of a professional, someone who puts the welfare of their patient or client above their own income.
So, a question from Sue Baldoff in the Q&A: doesn't that apply to other types of screening, colon cancer screening, mammograms? How do we know when screening is good and when it's not good?
We need to have a prospective randomized trial. Now, in breast cancer screening, we've had a prospective randomized trial done at least a dozen times in the United States and Europe. I still have said that people think breast cancer screening is better than it actually is, but breast cancer screening clearly does save lives. It clearly saves lives. There are still some issues with overtreatment, especially in the area of ductal carcinoma in situ, which is, I actually consider it not to be cancer. It's a precancerous lesion. We treat a lot of ductal carcinoma in situ that will never progress to cancer. It's part of the learning process. In colon cancer screening, ironically, we got really great prospective randomized trials of stool blood testing, and associated with that, colonoscopy. I'm sometimes outspoken in noting that I'm not against colonoscopy screening, by the way, but the science to show that stool blood testing saves lives is actually stronger than the science to show that colonoscopy saves lives. I repeat, I'm not against colonoscopy screening. In thyroid cancer, we've got great data.
Is there a difference between sigmoidoscopy and colonoscopy there?
Yeah, sigmoidoscopy is looking at a third to a half of the colon, whereas colonoscopy is looking at the entire colon. There is data to show that sigmoidoscopy saves lives. And that data actually, ironically, is stronger than the clinical trials looking at colonoscopy. Sigmoidoscopy has sort of fallen out of favor. People either get colonoscopy or they get stool blood testing today. It's rare someone is offered sigmoidoscopy screening these days.
So we have these new, how do you think about this? And I should disclose here that you're probably not going to answer any questions about the Grail test and that you've consulted for that company.
Yes.
But there are several of these multi-cancer detection tests, blood tests to detect cancer that are in development. How do you think about these issues when we look at these new tests?
I think there's more than 30 that are in some phase of development right now, and I'm really concerned. It's a tremendous opportunity in terms of science. We have redefined what cancer is as part of Nixon's war on cancer and the National Cancer Act. And I think the multi-cancer early detection tests, these blood tests for cancer, are going to be very important as we go off into the future, both in understanding results of treatment and whether someone has responded, as well as in screening and early detection. Right now, I think those tests should only be used with standard screening. One should not get an MCED blood test in lieu of colon cancer screening or in lieu of breast cancer screening or prostate or lung screening, but along with those, if one chooses to do it. And this is the time now to very carefully figure these tests out. We have a long history in medicine going back to the Pap smear, where we have instituted screening without adequately assessing the tests. And sometimes, in the case of neuroblastoma screening with a urine test in children, in the case of chest X-ray screening for lung cancer in the 1960s, we have had, even in the case of mammography in the 70s, we have had to back off and say, let's slow this down because we're going too fast and we're starting to hurt people. So with MCEDs, we desperately need to very carefully assess these things. And with 30 different companies, each having a slightly different test, if we're not careful, this is going to be the wild, wild west of screening. And it's going to make the prostate-specific antigen prostate screening wars look easy compared to what could happen. It could be the wild, wild west of screening.
So before we get further into screening, and I've got two questions here from the audience that I want to go to, but I want to ask another big question I wanted to make sure I got to with you, which is, for a lot of your career, you practiced at Grady Hospital. And unlike, I don't want to impugn people, but you really seemed to practice. You had a lot of stories about patients. Why do we have such a problem in terms of health equity, in terms of inequality in medicine in this country?
Well, I have a love-hate relationship with Grady and the safety net hospitals. I practiced at Grady, which is a safety net hospital, for 20 years. I was the chief of oncology there for 8 of those 20 years. I like the people who come there, and those people need to get good care. At the same time, what we have in American medicine is true segregation, separate but unequal. The quality of care that people get in these safety net hospitals is not as good as in these private hospitals where people with insurance go. If there were no Grady, they would get no care whatsoever. Which is why I am very supportive and love Grady. It provides folks with care that they would never be able to get. But I am still very critical of American medicine, that we truly do have. It amounts to economic segregation in terms of the quality of care that people get in the United States.
Is there any low-hanging fruit to fixing that system? I mean, we've just described a system with bad data and inequality.
Yes. Well, I think
things that both are pretty bad problems. Like, is there any low-hanging fruit to making this better?
Well, I think the solution is to give people adequate insurance, and then you need to give everybody some type of navigation or some type of guidance to figure out some type of navigation or guidance to figure out how to utilize that insurance. And then you need to give people some support. We had a whole bunch of people who didn't keep appointments and actually harm their treatment because they didn't have transportation. Some basic social supports are some of the things. We're the richest country in the world. We spend 18% of our 18% of our gross domestic product on healthcare, which is more than any other country. It's more than 60% more than any other country in the world. And we have some of the greatest disparities because we have these people who can't get healthcare. It's just purely logistics. One of the things that I'm an epidemiologist as well, and one of the things that we calculated a few years ago is that if everybody got what every human being should get, of the 600,000 deaths that are going to occur from cancer this year, 132,000 would go away. Now, that's everything that every human being should get, from prevention through appropriate screening, appropriate diagnostics, and appropriate treatment. And by the way, the punchline of that is, of the 132,000, that quantifies the disparity in cancer. Of the 132,000, 70 to 80,000 are white. What we figured out is there's a whole bunch of people who suffer from health disparities. If you're Black or Hispanic, you're more likely to suffer from those disparities, but the largest group of people who actually do are white.
So a related question from a viewer, one David Sampson, is there a potential downside to race-based screening recommendations?
Oh, I think absolutely so. Race is a socioeconomic categorization. It is not a biologic categorization. People so frequently in the United States think that race equates with differing biology. Every time I've been able to figure out there's different biology between Blacks and whites, it's because of some social determinant, such as the prevalence of Black women who have children and don't breastfeed is higher. And that's related to the higher prevalence of triple negative breast cancer in those women 30 to 40 years later. So there's this movement afoot, especially in prostate and in lung cancer, to have race-based screening guidelines. And I'm just very, very concerned that makes people think that race equates with biology. I would actually, by the way, put much more emphasis on getting people adequate treatment. I'm frequently asked, should we screen Black women for breast cancer 5 or 10 years earlier? Instead of 45, should we go to 40 or 35? But nobody ever asked me about the fact that 40% of Black women over 50 don't get screened, period. And if we could provide that 40% with adequate screening, adequate diagnosis, and adequate treatment, the number of lives that could be saved and the number of life years that could be saved are far greater than if screening works for Black women aged 35 to 44, which I don't even know if it does.
So what about using, Aaron Feliciano wants to ask, what about using genetics as a basis for screening for cancer?
We're starting to move into genetics for screening for cancer, but again, like the experience with cervical cancer screening going back into the 1940s and 50s, where a large number of women ended up being treated with hysterectomy, it turns out they didn't even have cancer. Or same thing happened with breast cancer screening in the 1970s. We need to be very careful as we go forth with genetics and genetic testing. I'm very much in favor of studies to better figure out how to do it. We're not ready to do it yet. To a certain extent, the MCED tests are genetic tests for screening.
Another data question. You've also paid a lot of attention to the treatment space, to new medicines coming out. And we've seen a lot of drugs that are inarguably effective in late stage patients, the targeted precision medicine miracles, really. But a lot of them don't have the kind of randomized controlled data that you're talking about. Very often these are done as single arm studies. Where is that leading us?
Yeah,
Is this the right direction?
It's one of my great concerns. Medicine is progressing at such a rate, our ability to figure out how to assess it is lagging behind. We have now got some precision medicines that have been FDA approved, not through randomized trials, which is a prospective randomized trial allows me to figure out, is drug A better than drug B? Well, when I look, and I have, by the way, prospective randomized trials where shrinkage of disease did not mean the people lived longer. Now I have these precision drugs that don't allow me to do randomized trials because there's not enough people out there with the target. It'd be very difficult to organize a prospective randomized trial. And we're starting to accept some of these shrinkage, assuming the shrinkage does mean people live longer. The smarter people are looking at not just shrinkage, but quality of life. Are we improving the quality of life of the patients? But this is a huge problem. And it's going to get worse as we develop more and more drugs. And even when we have some prospective randomized trials, many of these drugs that are approved through prospective randomized trials are approved because they increase median survival by 3 or 4 months. And one has to wonder, is the pain of taking the drug, including the financial pain, is it worth?
But also side effects come. A lot of them cause really bad diarrhea.
When I say pain, I'm talking about all the side effects. And you're right: diarrhea, nausea, vomiting. A lot of skin rashes involved in a lot of the new precision medicines. Are they worth the chance that you might have a 3-month median survival increase? And then, of course, everybody who takes this drug knows that that 3-month median is a bell curve, and there's somebody who is way out there at 9 to 12 months, and everybody assumes that they're going to be the person way out there benefiting a lot. And meanwhile, we don't even have good ways to figure out if the patient truly did benefit.
So we just brought up a bunch of different issues in somewhat unrelated: treatment-based data, screening-based data, and then these the health equity issues, the issues of people really not having access to care or knowing it's there. Or are there common roots to some of these problems? When you look at all these different things that you talk about, are you seeing them all as different things, or in some ways do you see one thing? Do you see
I see a couple of different things, maybe 3 things that contribute to all of them. By the way, the solution of figuring out if some of these drugs work may very well be use of MCEDs to look at response.
The test I mentioned earlier, the
blood test. Yes, the blood test for cancer, some people want to use for screening, may be useful in assessing response.
That's a common problem we see, that the commercial use for new technology isn't always the use we need.
That's right. That's exactly right. Now, people not understanding the science, 1, and 2, not being orthodox to the science, 2.
You said that twice. What do you mean by orthodox?
Okay. In oncology especially, but in medicine in general, we have a bunch of people who we have a word for it in medicine. We call them gunslingers. These are people who don't really look at what the science says and don't look at what the clinical trials have showed us and apply the clinical trials as the clinical trials were done. They sort of pick and choose from the clinical trials what they want to pick and choose and design therapies that they're going to give to this individual patient. So the patient becomes a clinical trial of one. And you'll see a doctor who says, well, in breast cancer, we use adriamycin, Cytoxan, and Taxol to treat this patient. Well, I'm going to use Adria and Cytoxan from this trial. And then I see over in Europe, they use carboplatin. Instead of Taxol, I'm going to substitute carboplatin. You know, that sort of thing. It's the way I cook in the kitchen.
Mhm.
That's how they do chemotherapy. I think we should be orthodox. If the patient doesn't fit the clinical trial or is way out of qualification for going on the clinical trial, we shouldn't treat them with the drugs in the clinical trial. I'll tell you, in minorities, especially Black women with breast cancer, where we see people extrapolating is we have a huge obesity problem. 70% of Black women are either obese or overweight. Black women with breast cancer very regularly get dosed with chemotherapy with ideal body weight instead of their real body weight. We don't have a clinical trial to show that ideal body weight is the appropriate thing to do, but a lot of doctors do it. That's gunslinging.
So
I mean,
you were
literally,
saying that the lack of that orthodoxy was one of the common themes you see here. I don't want to lose that question I asked.
That's right. That's right. The lack of orthodoxy is a huge problem in medicine. The other problem in medicine is people who just simply don't know and don't understand. And the third issue that complicates things is the fact that we make money in medicine. There's some people who still, unfortunately, are not that professional that I was saying that puts the welfare of their patient above themselves.
Which of those problems do you think is fixable?
I think all three of them are fixable. We can drive the small proportion who are greedy out of medicine if we speak up. And I think we need to actually start policing ourselves better. You know, one of the reasons why I encourage people to go into clinical trials, if they possibly can go into a clinical trial, is when you're in a clinical trial, there are people who are looking over the doctor's shoulder, who are checking to make sure that the chemotherapy was dosed appropriately, that the linear accelerator for radiation is a late model machine that is appropriately calibrated, and that the beam is aimed appropriately. I mention this because these are all things that I see go wrong when some people are treated. Keep in mind, one of my studies from a few years ago said that 30% of women treated for breast cancer in the United States have something in their treatment that is suboptimal. 1 in 3. Okay. The pathologists, we've got great studies to show that pathologists in overworked hospitals tend not to stage patients as well as in hospitals where they only see 2 or 3 patients a day. Those happen to be.
So you don't know as well whether the cancer is early or late, and therefore how to treat it.
That's right. That's right. They literally spend less time assessing the surgical specimen in hospitals where they're just overwhelmed with large numbers of patients. And the end result is the patient is misstaged, therefore ends up getting inappropriate treatment.
So another question from the audience about health disparities from Neha Jain. When tackling health disparities, would you suggest basing strategies on race and ethnicity or other metrics such as income or insurance status? And are there unintended consequences of focusing on race and ethnicity?
The unintended consequence of focusing too much on race and ethnicity is people tend, in the United States, where we all see things through this racist lens, people tend to think that race determines things that it doesn't really determine. I would prefer to look at that race equals biology, inherent biology that's immutable and not changeable. You know,
even social factors, which can vary a lot within race.
I would look at social factors more than anything else. You know, there's some really important, let's talk about breast cancer for a second. There's some really important studies in breast cancer that people don't realize. For example, There are 11 states in the United States where a white woman has a higher risk of breast cancer death than Black women in Massachusetts. There are 5 states in the United States where Black and white women have the same death rate from breast cancer. Yet I'm constantly hearing about how breast cancer is more aggressive in Black women. They actually have a whole bunch of Black women thinking if you're diagnosed with breast cancer and you're Black, you're definitely going to die. The focus should be on getting every human being optimal therapy. Because remember, as I told you earlier, the majority of people who get less than optimal therapy are white.
Mm-hmm. So I asked you about the worst moment in your medical career. What's been the best? Not that you could be in front of you, but
yeah, I've had some wonderful, wonderful moments in my career. Some of them with patients, some of them with patients' families, even after the patient died. But I have to say that the best moment was when I was inducted into the National Academy of Medicine. And it was because, the little thing that, the little 3 sentences why you're inducted, for me, it was because of my advocacy of orthodoxy in medicine and telling patients the truth. That meant a lot to me.
Is there any last truth you want to get out before we go? Anything you want to tell patients right now?
Well, I think patients should take interest in their disease, try to talk to their doctors and learn about their disease from their doctors. I think calling folks like the American Cancer Society or going to reputable websites like the American Society for Clinical Oncology. There's several other very reputable websites, and trying to learn about your disease and trying to talk about it is the way that you can get the best high quality care. I think asking for navigation, asking for people to guide you through the system is also incredibly important. And take a relative with you if you have a bad problem. Take a relative with you to the doctor. Don't go alone.
All right. Great. Thank you so much, Otis. This has been a lot of fun. It's always nice to see you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the interview.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. And give me 1 second here because I misplaced my notes. But with that, we're out of time. I'd like to thank our event sponsor, YouTube, and all of you who are here to join us. This wraps up this year's Status List program. We hope you enjoyed our chats with some of the standout individuals in life sciences. Make sure to tune into our last virtual event of the year next Wednesday, when my colleagues Damien Garde and Angus Chen will recap the annual ASH meeting. That's December 14th at 1 p.m. That's the hematology meeting. They'll chat with industry experts about what's happening in cancer and in other bloodborne diseases, and more information can be found on our website. Thank you again. Stay safe, be well. I hope if whatever holidays you might celebrate this time of year, you have a wonderful holiday. Thank you.